Welcome back as we get into the final segment of the GSMC Sports Podcast for the day, and that is getting into some college basketball. Before we get into briefly the games, not that they were the highest of stakes games, we had some first four matchups that took place last night. One in particular had a lot of college basketball fans angry, but first I want to dive into the news about Kevin McCullar Jr. Kevin McCullar Jr. is the leading scorer for the Jayhawks this season. He has been dealing with some injuries down the stretch of the season, specifically a bone bruise in his knee that's really been bothering him. And yesterday, head coach Bill Self said emphatically that McCullar will be out for the NCAA tournament. He didn't say that there was a possibility of him coming back. They said that they are shutting him down, and that is it, which is a little bit surprising considering the fact that when it was first announced that he and Hunter Dickinson would both be missing the Big 12 tournament that took place last week, that it was somewhat seen to be a little more precautionary than anything else. And now instead we see that it was maybe a little more serious than even expected in terms of McCullar's injury. Now, like I mentioned, he missed some time during the last month or so of the regular season, but he was able to return and play over 30 minutes in a game versus Baylor. So it seemed like he was on the right track to continue to come back and be strong enough to go into the NCAA tournament, and now instead we see that he is ruled out, which really hurts a Jayhawks team that has been struggling with depth through the season as a whole. It's been a big-time storyline with them, where while they do have some of their key standout players, such as himself, Hunter Dickinson, I really like KJ Adams as well, but it's been a lot of scrambling almost to completely fill out their roster. They had former five-star recruit Elmarco Jackson start the season for them, but he very much underperformed for them. He ends up getting benched for Johnny Furphy Jr., who really showed some flashes offensively, but the consistency hasn't necessarily been there, and it does seem like there's just a lack of edge and physicality with him a little bit that does concern me in terms of maybe it's because I'm a little bit more of an NBA guy. He's been projected into the lottery at times. I don't see that with him. I think Furphy would need another year, but specifically about the college basketball conversation, I still feel like he's a good player, but that's kind of about the depths that they can go, where we've seen some of these other players try and step up for them, like in the Big 12 tournament against Cincinnati, and they, as much as KJ Adams was doing everything in his power to stand in there, it just wasn't enough, and they end up getting blown out in that game, which, you know, is not a good sign now headed into the NCAA tournament, where they're going to play a very pesky Samford team in the 4-13 matchup that I was picking Samford going into this without the news of McCullar not playing. Now, I'm curious. I want to check right now as well what we're looking at for the betting odds on this game, because I'm sure that Kansas is still going to be favored, but it's down to 7.5 points, which is still pretty decent. But Samford is a team that presses you all game long, and for Kansas here to be as shorthanded as they are and now have to face this type of opponent, I think that they could fatigue quickly, and I'm not sure if they're going to have the legs and the depth to rely on off the bench in order to help elevate them over this matchup. Now, ultimately, playing a 13 seed, it would be disappointing for them, absolutely, if they weren't able to win this game, but ultimately, we're talking about Kansas here. Big picture, I don't think anybody was ever really picking them to win the national championship anyways. So it's not like this is some massive revelation. Again, even if McCullar wasn't out, I think a lot of people probably would have had them out before the first weekend anyways. But it's a bummer for Kansas, who now has lost their leading scorer in the tournament this year. Last year, Bill Self had a heart condition that he had to get surgery on, I believe, that took him out of them coaching last year. So after winning the national championship in 2021, 2 straight years in 2022, now 2 straight years of a big-time loss from a personnel standpoint with the Jayhawks that could be holding them back. So we'll see if I'm proven wrong, but I am definitely worried about Kansas in these coming days. They tip off against Samford on Thursday night at 9:55 Eastern. So we will see how that all plays out. But getting into some of the matchups from last night, specifically the one that had a lot of people upset, Virginia versus Colorado State. Virginia had a down year this season, and with the style of game that they play as it is, never being really all too much of a talented offense, they were not the most popular with a lot of NCAA fans, and their resume didn't necessarily jump out all that much either, especially struggling down the stretch of the year as well. Coming into 2024, they suffered multiple blowout losses down the stretch of the season and really didn't have too much of impressive wins to stand by. And now here they are. They end up getting the spot. There were a lot of people upset about the lack of some of the Big East teams that were left out. Ultimately, it was none of them that were even the first couple teams out. The first team out was Oklahoma. So you take out Virginia, Oklahoma would have replaced. Indiana State as well was second, who, granted, both of those teams were better than Virginia. And, you know, traditionally, it's sort of unfair to get on the committee after watching the results that happen. But if there were to be an exception to that, it is probably this game, where everybody knew that Virginia was pretty fraudulent, and you were banking on the idea of Virginia basketball being able to play that smothering defense that, you know, they're still not bad defensively, but it's just not the same as what we saw when they won the national championship in 2019. And I do think that it becomes a very interesting conversation when you look at Virginia basketball and the way that they typically play under Tony Bennett with this hard-nosed defense. They typically, and you look at 2019, they had a lot of veteran guys on their roster. And now we are in an era of college sports where it's not necessarily what we see. We see a lot more transfers and a lack of guys really sticking around for too long. Out of their group, they didn't have any freshmen that were getting big-time consistent minutes for them. DeAndre Hunter was the youngest of the group, where he was a sophomore. He ends up going to the NBA that following season as a lottery pick. But again, outside of that, it was based a lot on sort of developing an identity on defense, the cohesiveness of that team, and now they fall short again, have not won a tournament game, I believe, since winning the national championship in 2019, and it just brings on a lot of questions. I don't think it's questioning Tony Bennett, the coach himself, but more so about whether or not that system of basketball can still survive in a college sports atmosphere where we see the transfer portal being such a prominent factor, how we don't see the development of an individual player in one system for a handful of years. And it's just really interesting to think about with Virginia because they have had some kind of roller coaster, even dating back to, of course, the year prior to winning the national championship, being the first 1 seed to ever be upset by a 16 seed. So they have been all over the place since then, and now find themselves out after the first 4 matchups. Ultimately, again, I'm not calling for any sort of a changing of the coach at Virginia, but I do think internally with that program, they might have to sort of reconsider some of the strategies that they play with, where this game was just so ugly. And understandably, it's important to keep in mind that it's sort of at least parts of the first half. The incompetence on offense was a little too much, but they do typically play, I wouldn't call it dirty. It's more so dirty in the fact that they just drag other teams into the mud and have these defensive matchups. We saw flashes of that in the first half, but then once Colorado State was able to get going, it was just not a contest. Virginia only scored 14 points in the first half. They went from the 9:20 mark of the first half to the 16:38 mark in the second half without a point. That is 12 minutes and 42 minutes of game time without a score. I saw the broadcast crew on True TV put one of the most absurd graphics that I personally have ever seen, where Virginia finally broke their scoring drought at 10:40 Eastern time, 10:40 p.m. Eastern time. They gave a graphic where they said Virginia's first points since 9:48 Eastern. So they took out the actual clock, not just the game clock, but the actual clock, and just buried them with that one, really. Almost a full hour without a point for Virginia. It was a really tough showing for them. For Colorado State here, I think that they are a good team. I had them coming out of this anyways, and I do think that there is real upset potential when they take on Texas in the round of 64, where in this game, we didn't even see the best version of Isaiah Stevens, who is their lead guard and is somebody that has sort of been looked at as someone who can win over a bunch of people and become a March Madness hero. It was more Joel Scott leading the charge for them, also a very solid player as well. He scores 23, but again, for Virginia, this was a very embarrassing performance for them, and really just unfortunate because we all want to see good basketball, and we absolutely did not get that from this matchup. Be curious to see how Colorado State plays from here on out. I guess briefly touching on the Wagner versus Howard game. To be honest, I didn't even necessarily know the full Wagner story here, but they haven't been practicing full contact for 2.5 months due to injuries. They have 7 active players that they've been playing with for the past couple months, and they come in here against Howard after, also keep in mind, with Wagner, they were just 13-15 in the regular season. They were the 6th seed in the NEC conference tournament, and they ended up winning, closing out the tournament, winning their first ever NCAA game against Howard here, and just really incredible stuff and really fun to see for them. Melvin Council Jr. was incredible, helped them come out to this double-digit lead that they carried for a lot of the game, but Howard ended up making this a really good matchup based off of some of the pressures and traps that they were throwing at the Seahawks. They end up getting the score down to 1 after an intentional foul situation. It was a 3-point game, and the Bisons had the ball with 14 seconds left, down by 3. They got 3 good looks from the 3-point line to tie that game. They had grabbed a couple offensive rebounds, but none of the shots fell, and the game ended up losing there So it did end up being a very fun finish and a nice way to kick off March Madness. So that was just the beginning of this tournament, and I do think that we are in for a real crazy one because of the way that we've seen this season play out. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Please like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. It helps us out a ton, and we will see you again tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So, yeah, see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go.